All right, ever wonder how the government gets the money to do, well, everything?
Yeah.
Roads, schools, even those space programs you hear about. It all comes down to taxes.
Uh,
Today, we're taking a deep dive into Congress's power to tax.
okay.
And we're not just skimming the surface.
Right.
We're going to uncover how this power works and why it matters to you using some insightful excerpts from a legal document that breaks it all down.
Interesting. What's fascinating is that this power, as laid out in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution, isn't just about collecting money.
Oh,
It's a tool that can be wielded to shape behavior and incentivize certain actions. It's more nuanced than it might seem at first glance.
so it's not as simple as just saying, hey, you owe us money.
Right.
There's a deeper layer of strategy involved.
Absolutely. Congress can use taxes to encourage or discourage certain behaviors.
Okay.
Think of it as a money lever that can pull in funds and nudge people towards certain actions.
That money lever analogy is a great way to visualize it. But I imagine there's some guardrails in place, right?
Sure.
Congress can't just go around taxing anything and everything without some limitations.
You're right, it's not a blank check. The Constitution includes some crucial limitations to prevent abuse and ensure fairness.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, any taxes imposed have to be uniform across all states.
Makes sense.
There are also specific rules for direct taxes.
Okay.
And interestingly, Congress can't tax exports.
Ah.
That last bit gets particularly complex when you consider the dynamics of international trade.
That makes sense. Checks and balances are vital, especially when we're talking about something as powerful as the ability to tax. Speaking of checks and balances, haven't there been some legal battles over how far Congress can go with this power?
There have been quite a few, actually. Several court cases have really illuminated the nuances and complexities of this power, showcasing how Congress has attempted to use and sometimes overstep its boundaries,
Right.
and how the courts have responded.
That's what I love about diving into legal cases, is that they bring these abstract concepts to life. So what kind of situations have landed Congress in hot water over its taxing power?
Well, one particularly illuminating case is the child labor tax case from 1922.
Okay.
Congress, attempting to address the issue of child labor, passed a tax specifically targeting employers of child laborers.
Mm-hmm.
On the surface, it seemed like they were trying to use taxes to regulate something that was ethically questionable.
That's a clever tactic, using taxes as a way to discourage a practice they couldn't outright ban. Did it work?
Not exactly. The Supreme Court saw through it and declared the tax a penalty in disguise,
Ooh.
ruling it unconstitutional.
Wow.
This case established a clear precedent. Taxes can't be punishments masquerading as revenue generators.
So Congress can't just slap a tax label on anything they disapprove of and call it a day.
Yep.
There has to be a genuine intention to raise revenue, right?
Precisely. The primary purpose has to be revenue generation. Now, fast forward to 1953, and we have U.S. v. Carter. This case revolved around a tax imposed on professional gamblers.
Gambling and taxes sounds like a recipe for some lively debate. What was the issue there?
Challengers argued that the tax was essentially a penalty, not a legitimate way to generate revenue. But the Supreme Court disagreed, affirming that Congress's power to tax is broad and that courts shouldn't interfere lightly with its exercise.
So even if a tax seems to step on the toes of state matters, Congress can still assert its authority.
As long as it demonstrably generates revenue, it's likely to be upheld.
Okay.
This case truly underscores how difficult it is to successfully challenge Congress's taxing authority.
This is getting more and more interesting.
Yeah.
It seems like there's this constant push and pull between Congress's broad powers and the need to ensure those powers aren't being abused.
Right.
And speaking of cases that stirred up some controversy, we can't forget about the landmark case of NFIB v. Sebelius, better known as the Affordable Care Act case.
Ah, yes, the individual mandate. This one sparked national debate.
It certainly did.
For those who need a refresher, the individual mandate required most Americans to have health insurance or pay a penalty. The constitutionality of this provision was hotly contested.
It certainly was. Many people saw this as government overreach, forcing citizens to purchase something they might not want or need. What was the court's verdict on this one?
It was a close call, but the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that the individual mandate was constitutional, classifying it as a tax rather than a penalty.
Hold on, so they called the penalty a tax. How did they reconcile that?
Several factors contributed to the court's decision.
Okay.
First, the payment went to the Treasury, and was integrated into the tax code enforced by the IRS.
I see.
Additionally, it didn't apply to individuals who didn't pay federal income taxes.
Right.
Plus, the amount was tied to income, and importantly, it generated revenue, even if that wasn't its primary aim. All of these factors together led the court to view it as a tax rather than a straight-up penalty.
So, even though it felt, to many, like a way to coerce people into buying health insurance, the structure of the mandate allowed the court to categorize it as falling within Congress's power to tax.
Exactly. And this brings us to a crucial point about the broader implications of Congress's taxing power.
Oh,
It's a point that often gets overlooked in the heat of these debates.
okay. This is where my brain starts to spin a little.
Yeah.
We've talked about Congress's power to tax,
Uh,
the limitations on that power,
right.
and some landmark cases.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm still grappling with how this all connects.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the taxing power is actually broader than the power to regulate commerce.
Right.
What does that actually mean in practice?
That's a key point.
Okay.
And it's one of the reasons this power is so significant.
Mm-hmm.
Congress can use its taxing authority to influence areas of our lives that it might not be able to directly regulate.
Okay.
Let's take the Affordable Care Act as an example.
Yeah.
The individual mandate, as we discussed, was ultimately upheld as a tax. But imagine if Congress had tried to pass a law simply stating, you must purchase health insurance.
That sounds like a much more direct form of regulation.
Exactly. And it likely would have faced more significant constitutional challenges.
Okay.
But by structuring it as a tax, Congress could achieve a similar outcome,
Mm-hmm.
albeit through a different mechanism. It's a bit like a roundabout way of influencing behavior.
So the taxing power gives Congress this incredible flexibility to impact areas that might fall outside its direct regulatory reach.
Right.
Is that a cause for concern?
Well,
Could this lead to a situation where Congress essentially dictates our choices through taxes?
that's where the idea of general federalism concern comes into play.
Okay.
This concept recognizes that Congress's broad taxing power, while important, needs to be balanced against the principle of federalism, the division of power between the federal government and the states. It's a recognition that while the federal government has significant powers, those powers shouldn't be used to completely usurp the autonomy of the states or the individual choices of citizens.
That makes sense. It's all about striking that balance.
Mm.
But I'm still trying to wrap my head around what general federalism concern looks like in reality. Can you give me a concrete example?
Certainly. Let's consider environmental policy.
Okay.
Congress might not have the power to directly dictate what kind of energy sources each state uses.
Right.
However, it could use taxes to incentivize certain choices.
Okay.
For example, it could impose a tax on carbon emissions or offer tax credits for investments in renewable energy.
Ah, so instead of a top-down mandate, it's more of a nudge in a particular direction.
Exactly.
It's like using financial incentives to guide behavior rather than outright controlling it.
Precisely. And this indirect approach often leads to less resistance and more gradual shifts in behavior.
Right.
Of course, it also raises questions about fairness and effectiveness.
That's an excellent point. It seems like there's always a trade-off involved.
Yeah.
On one hand, Congress has this powerful tool to address important issues. On the other hand, there is the risk of overreach and the potential for unintended consequences. How do we as citizens navigate this complex landscape?
It starts with awareness. Understanding the scope of Congress's taxing power and how it can be used is the first step. Then comes engagement. We need to pay attention to how this power is being used in specific policy areas, and we need to make our voices heard.
So it's not just about understanding the legal framework. It's about actively participating in the conversation about how these powers are used.
Yeah.
That brings me back to the child labor tax case.
Okay.
We talked about how the Supreme Court drew a line between legitimate taxes and penalties in disguise.
Right.
But where exactly is that line drawn?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a clear-cut test?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
There's no simple formula. The courts have developed various factors to consider when determining whether a tax is a legitimate revenue-raising measure or a penalty masquerading as a tax. One key factor is the amount of the tax.
Okay.
A tax that's so high it effectively prohibits an activity is more likely to be considered a penalty.
That makes sense. A hefty tax that's designed to make something practically impossible to do sounds more like a punishment than a way to generate revenue. What other factors come into play?
Another important factor is scienter.
Scienter.
That's a fancy legal term for knowledge or intent. If the tax is structured in a way that requires knowledge of wrongdoing to trigger the tax liability, it's more likely to be viewed as a penalty. Think of it this way. If you unknowingly commit a violation but still get hit with a hefty tax, it starts to feel less like a revenue-generating measure and more like a punishment.
So the intent behind the tax matters. If it feels like Congress is using taxes as a roundabout way to punish behavior rather than raise revenue, the courts are likely to intervene. It's like they're saying, "We see what you're doing there, Congress."
Exactly. And the courts have gotten pretty adept at identifying these disguised penalties.
This is all incredibly fascinating. It feels like we're peeling back the layers of an onion, revealing more and more complexity with each layer.
That's a great analogy. And the reality is there's always more to uncover.
I'm starting to realize that this isn't just a legal discussion. It's a conversation about the very fabric of our society. The power to tax touches every aspect of our lives.
You're absolutely right. It shapes what we consume, how we invest, the choices we make, and the kind of world we live in.
It's powerful, it's complex, and it's something we all need to be more aware of. So with all that in mind, what are some of the key takeaways we should be leaving our listeners with today?
First and foremost, Congress's power to tax is incredibly broad, but it's not unlimited.
Right.
The courts have played a crucial role in defining the boundaries of this power. Second, understanding the nuances of taxing power is essential for informed citizenship. We need to be aware of how this power is being used and how it impacts our lives.
And lastly,
We need to engage. It's not enough to just understand the legal framework.
right.
We need to participate in the conversation about tax policy, make our voices heard, and hold our elected officials accountable.
I couldn't have said it better myself. This is a topic that deserves our attention, our critical thinking, and our active participation.
Mm.
It's amazing how something we encounter every day, like paying taxes, can have such a profound impact on our lives.
It is, yeah.
I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on this topic.
Uh-huh.
I'm curious, thinking back to the cases we discussed,
Yeah.
were there any dissenting opinions that stood out to you?
Oh, yeah.
I'm always intrigued by those judges who dared to go against the majority.
There were quite a few, actually. Dissenting opinions often provide valuable insights into the complexities of a case and the differing perspectives within the court. In the child labor tax case, for instance, Justice Holmes, in his dissent, argued that the purpose of the tax should not be the primary consideration in determining its constitutionality.
Interesting. So he was essentially saying that as long as a tax generated revenue,
Yeah.
its intended purpose, even if it was to regulate or discourage a specific behavior, shouldn't be the deciding factor.
That was his argument. He felt that the court was overstepping its bounds by delving into the motivations behind the tax. His view was that if Congress had the power to tax, it should be free to use that power as it saw fit, as long as it stayed within the constitutional boundaries of uniformity and didn't tax exports.
That's a compelling argument. It highlights the tension between judicial restraint and the court's role in ensuring that Congress doesn't abuse its powers. It seems like there's always this delicate dance between those two principles.
Absolutely. And it's these dissenting voices that often help us to see those nuances more clearly. They challenge our assumptions and force us to think critically about even those rulings that we might initially agree with.
We've explored the legal framework, the historical context, and even delved into some of the dissenting opinions that have shaped our understanding of Congress's power to tax. But I want to bring it back to our listener for a moment. What can they do with all of this newfound knowledge? It's one thing to understand the complexities of tax law, but how can they actually make a difference?
That's a great question. Awareness is the first step, and we've hopefully accomplished that today. But knowledge without action is like a seed that never gets planted. It has the potential to grow, but it needs the right conditions to flourish.
So what's the fertile ground for this particular seed of knowledge? Where can our listener go to channel this newfound awareness into something meaningful?
The most important thing is to stay engaged. Pay attention to tax-related news and policy debates. Don't just skim the headlines, dig deeper, understand the arguments on both sides, and form your own opinions.
That's sound advice.
Yeah.
We're bombarded with information these days, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. But taking the time to really understand the issues that impact us is crucial.
Absolutely. And once you've formed those opinions, don't keep them to yourself. Talk to your friends, family, colleagues, share what you've learned and listen to their perspectives. You might be surprised by what you learn from those conversations.
Engaging in respectful dialogue is so important, especially in today's polarized climate.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the echo chambers of social media, But real change happens when we step outside of those bubbles and engage with people who might hold different views.
And don't forget about your elected officials.
Right.
They work for you. Contact their offices, let them know your concerns, and hold them accountable for their decisions on tax policy. It might feel like a small act, but those individual voices, when amplified collectively, can truly make a difference.
It's been an incredible journey exploring this intricate world of taxing power. We've uncovered the legal foundations, grappled with complex cases, and even contemplated dissenting opinions.
Uh-huh.
But most importantly, we've empowered our listener with knowledge, encouraging them to become active participants in shaping the future of tax policy.
Okay.
And that's what the Deep Dive is all about. Inspiring curiosity, encouraging critical thinking, and empowering our listeners to become more informed and engaged citizens.
Well said.
Until our next deep dive, stay curious, keep exploring, and never underestimate the power of your voice.